If you only see people through glass, you're not seeing them at all. Evelyn Carter stood 38 floors above the street, one hand wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold, the other resting lightly against the glass wall that separated her from the rest of the world. The city stretched out beneath her in clean lines and quiet motion. Cars inching through traffic, people crossing intersections like patterns she could almost predict. Inside, everything was quieter, controlled, filtered. She preferred it that way. From here, she didn't have to hear the noise. She didn't have to feel the weight of it. She only had to observe. Her office was built entirely of glass, walls, doors, even the conference room behind her. Transparency, the architects had called it. Visibility. But Evelyn had learned long ago that glass didn't make things clearer. It made them distant, manageable. On the far side of the lobby below, a man moved slowly across the polished marble floor, pushing a maintenance cart that rattled softly with each step. She noticed him the way she noticed everything, quickly, precisely, without attachment. Dark jacket, worn jeans, a backpack slung over one shoulder that didn't quite match the uniform policy. He paused near the security desk, said something to the guard. The guard laughed. The man didn't. He just nodded once, then kept moving. Evelyn's eyes lingered for a second longer than usual. Not because there was anything remarkable about him. There wasn't. He blended into the building the way shadows did at dusk, present, but easy to ignore. Still, something about the way he moved didn't fit the rhythm of the place. Too steady, too unhurried. As if he wasn't trying to impress anyone. As if he didn't need to. She turned slightly, glancing at the live security feed displayed on the wall behind her desk. Multiple angles, multiple floors, each frame clean, organized, efficient. She found him again on camera 3. The resolution flattened him, turned him into data, movement patterns, timestamps, productivity metrics. Easier to understand that way. Easier to categorize. He stopped near a column, crouched briefly, adjusted something at the baseboard. No call. No report. Just a quiet fix. Then he stood and moved on. Evelyn took a sip of her coffee and immediately regretted it. Cold. Bitter. She set it down without a second thought. Below, the man reached the far end of the lobby where a small child stood near the revolving doors, clutching a backpack too big for her frame. The child looked lost. The man slowed. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice. He said something. Evelyn couldn't hear it through the glass, couldn't read his lips from this distance. The child nodded. He pointed gently toward the reception desk, then stepped back, giving her space to walk on her own. No lingering. No need for recognition. Within seconds, he was already moving again, disappearing past a column and out of frame. Evelyn didn't rewind the footage. She didn't mark the moment. It wasn't part of any report she needed to review. It didn't affect quarterly projections or operational efficiency. It was just there. And then it wasn't. She shifted her weight slightly, pressing her fingertips against the glass again, looking down at the lobby as if something might still be happening there. But the space had already reset itself. New people, new movements, clean lines, predictable patterns. The man was gone, and whatever had just passed between him and the child, whatever quiet thing had existed for those few seconds, was gone with him. Evelyn exhaled slowly, barely noticing the way her reflection stared back at her from the glass. Sharp, composed, untouched. She had built her world this way for a reason. Up here, nothing unexpected lasted long enough to matter. Up here, everything made sense. Or at least, it looked like it did. The elevator doors opened without a sound, just a soft shift in pressure that most people never noticed. But Marcus did, because he noticed things that did not ask to be seen, and he stepped out into the hallway with the same steady pace, pushing his cart with one hand while the other adjusted the strap of the small backpack resting against his shoulder. The zipper slightly open, revealing the corner of a worksheet covered in uneven pencil marks and a child's careful handwriting, and he paused. Near the service panel halfway down the corridor, tilting his head just enough to listen, not to the building itself, but to the rhythm beneath it, the faint hum that most would call background noise, but he understood as something closer to language, something that told him when a system was working and when it was only pretending to, and he crouched again, not in a hurry, not performing, just present, unscrewing the panel with a worn multi-tool that had seen better days, and behind the metal cover a small cluster of wires sat just slightly out of alignment, Nothing urgent, nothing that would trigger an alert, but enough to grow into something larger if left alone, and Marcus adjusted it with careful fingers, not forcing, not rushing, just enough pressure to guide it back into place. Then he closed the panel and stood, wiping his hands on a folded cloth he kept in his back pocket, his movements quiet, almost invisible, and above him, 2 floors up and separated by layers of glass and polished steel, Evelyn shifted her gaze from one screen to another, her eyes scanning lines of data that confirmed everything was functioning within acceptable ranges, efficiency metrics holding steady, no anomalies flagged, no disruptions reported, and she moved on without hesitation because that was how she worked, forward, always forward, never lingering on what did not demand attention. And in her world, if something did not show up on a report, it did not exist in a way that mattered, and she tapped lightly on her tablet, approving a set of staffing adjustments recommended by her operations team. Numbers balanced, projections aligned, unnecessary redundancies identified and marked for removal, and somewhere in that list, among rows of names reduced to roles and hours and cost per week, Marcus Hale appeared as a line item that did not justify itself on paper: part-time maintenance, off-peak shift, limited interaction with core operations, and she did not pause on his name, not because she chose not to, but because there was nothing there that asked her to, and she confirmed the changes with a single motion, her signature appearing in clean digital ink: final, efficient, done, and below. Marcus checked his watch, noting the time with a small nod to himself because he had exactly 45 minutes before he needed to be across town to pick up his daughter from after-school care, and he moved toward the lobby again, passing the same stretch of glass that separated the building from the street, his reflection faint and easy to ignore, and as he reached the revolving doors, he stopped just long enough to pull his phone from his pocket, the screen lighting up with a missed call and a short message that read, "Dad, I got a gold star today," and his expression softened in a way no camera above would register, no system would log, and he typed back slowly, carefully, "Proud of you, kiddo. Save me one smile when I get there," then slipped the phone away and stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the glass doors turning behind him, closing the space he had just occupied as if he had never been there at all. The next morning arrived without announcement, just a quiet shift in light that slid across the glass walls of Evelyn's office, turning reflections into outlines and outlines into something almost real, and she stood in the same place she always did, coffee in hand, watching the building come alive beneath her as employees filtered in with practiced urgency, their movements sharp, purposeful, predictable, and she tracked them the way she tracked everything, not as individuals, but as patterns. Clusters of motion that told her whether the day would run smoothly or begin to fracture, and for a while, everything aligned exactly as expected until it did not, because on one of the smaller monitors tucked into the lower corner of her display wall, a subtle flicker appeared, not dramatic, not enough to trigger an alert, just a hesitation in the system feed that repeated twice before smoothing itself out. And Evelyn noticed it the way she noticed any inconsistency, immediately, precisely, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she tapped the screen to isolate the feed, pulling up the back-end metrics that confirmed what she already suspected, a latency issue building somewhere deep in the infrastructure. Not critical yet, but moving in that direction, and she straightened, setting her coffee aside as she called down to the operations floor, her voice calm, measured, expecting a clean answer, a quick fix, because that was how things worked here, problems identified, problems solved. But the response that came back carried a hesitation she did not like, a pause just long enough to suggest uncertainty. And she listened as the lead engineer explained that they had been tracking minor inconsistencies since late yesterday, nothing that crossed the threshold for escalation, nothing that justified pulling in additional resources. And Evelyn's gaze shifted back to the screen, to the place where the flicker had been, her mind moving quickly through possibilities, none of them acceptable, because small issues did not stay small for long, not in a system built this tightly. And she asked a single question, sharp and direct: who last accessed the panel tied to that node? And there was a brief silence before the answer came, a name pulled from a log: Marcus Hale, maintenance, evening shift, and the name meant nothing to her, not as a person, not as a presence, just a point of contact in a chain of activity, and she nodded once even though they could not see it. then said bring him in, and below, the engineers exchanged quick looks, one of them already pulling up the staffing records, noting the update that had been processed late yesterday, the reduction list, the removal of non-essential roles, and Marcus Hale was already marked for termination, effective end of day, and the engineer hesitated before speaking again, explaining that Marcus would not be on schedule, that his access would likely be revoked within the hour, and Evelyn paused, not because the information surprised her, but because it created a gap she did not like, a missing piece in a sequence that should have been clean, and she pressed her fingers lightly against the glass as she looked down at the lobby again, as if the answer might still be there somewhere, in the space he had occupied the day before. But the floor was already filled with new movement, new faces, none of them carrying the quiet steadiness she had briefly noticed without understanding, and for the first time that morning, something did not align, not in the system, not in the numbers, but in the space between what she had seen and what she had actually understood. By mid-morning, the hesitation in the system had grown into something harder to ignore, not a failure, not yet, but a drag that moved through the building like a slow current beneath still water, screens responding a fraction too late, data refreshing with a faint delay that most employees brushed off as nothing. But Evelyn did not believe in nothing. She believed in patterns, and patterns told stories long before problems announced themselves. And she stood at the center of her glass office, watching the numbers shift in ways that did not quite match the model she trusted, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of her desk as she listened to the updates coming in through her headset, engineers speaking in careful tones, choosing their words with precision because they knew she heard more than what was said, and one of them suggested rerouting part of the load, another proposed a temporary patch. Quick solutions meant to stabilize the surface without addressing whatever sat deeper, and Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief second, not out of frustration but to narrow her focus, because the answer was there, it had to be, and she asked them to pull the full access log from the previous 12 hours, every touchpoint, every adjustment, every silent interaction that had not triggered a report, and the data filled her screen in clean lines that almost hid the truth they carried, until she slowed down, scrolling past the obvious entries, past the scheduled maintenance, past the automated checks, until she found it again, a small entry, easy to miss, timestamped late in the evening, manual adjustment to a panel tied directly to the node now causing delay, and the name was still there, Marcus Hale. And this time she did not move past it so quickly, because the sequence did not make sense. The issue had not started with him, but something about his touch had intersected with it, not causing, not breaking, just touching it, and she turned away from the screen, her gaze drifting back to the glass wall that overlooked the lobby, as if memory might fill in what data could not. And for a moment she saw it again, not clearly, not perfectly, just a fragment, the way he had crouched without urgency, the way he had moved without asking for permission, the way nothing in his posture suggested he needed to be noticed, and she realized something that did not sit comfortably with her. She had seen him, but she had not watched him, and there was a difference she had not accounted for, and below, the operations floor was beginning to feel the strain as systems slowed just enough to disrupt rhythm. Employees glancing at their screens with small frowns, conversations tightening, the smooth efficiency of the building starting to show faint cracks, and one of the engineers spoke again, more urgently now, suggesting they bring in outside support if the issue continued to escalate. But Evelyn did not answer right away, because she was still looking at that name, still holding on to that small moment she had almost ignored, and then she made a decision that did not come from the data, not entirely. She told them to delay any external calls, to hold the system steady as it was, and then she gave a new instruction, find him, not the file, not the record, find the man, and there was a pause on the line, a brief confusion, because that was not how things were usually done here, but no one questioned her for long. And as the order moved through the building, quiet and precise, Evelyn stepped closer to the glass, her reflection meeting her gaze for a second before she looked past it again. This time not at the patterns, not at the flow of people, but at the spaces between them, as if something important had been there all along, waiting for her to notice, not through the glass, but beyond it. Marcus did not hear the call right away because his phone was tucked deep in the side pocket of his worn jacket, buried beneath a folded permission slip and a small plastic container that still smelled faintly of apple slices. And he was standing outside a low brick school building watching the doors with quiet focus as children poured out in uneven waves, laughter spilling into the late afternoon air, backpacks bouncing, voices overlapping in a rhythm that felt nothing like the controlled silence of the tower he had left behind. And when his daughter finally appeared, stepping carefully down the concrete stairs with that same deliberate pace he carried, he smiled without thinking, the kind of smile that did not need to be seen to be real, and she spotted him almost immediately, her face lighting up as she broke into a small run, her shoes slapping lightly against the pavement as she closed the distance and wrapped her arms around him, her voice quick and bright as she told him about her day, about the gold star, about a math problem she almost got right. And he listened the way he did everything else, fully, without interruption, nodding, asking small questions, giving her space to finish each thought before adding his own. And for a while, the rest of the world stayed exactly where it belonged, somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere that did not matter as much as this moment, until the phone buzzed again, longer this time, more insistent, and he felt it through the fabric before he heard it, pulling it out with a slight frown as he glanced at the screen, an unknown number, then another, then a message marked urgent, and he hesitated, not because he did not understand urgency, but because he measured it differently, weighing what was in his hand against what stood in front of him. And his daughter noticed the shift in his expression, the way his attention pulled just slightly away, and she asked if everything was okay, and he crouched down to her level, the same way he had in the lobby, his voice steady as he told her it was just work, nothing to worry about, but that he might need to make a quick call, and she nodded, more understanding than her age should have required, stepping back just enough to give him space, and he answered on the third ring, his tone calm, direct, as he introduced himself, and on the other end, a voice moved, quickly, explaining the situation in clipped, professional language, system delays, unidentified variables, his name appearing in the logs, a request that did not quite sound like a request, and Marcus listened without interrupting, his eyes drifting briefly toward the street, toward the direction of the tower that now felt further away than it had that morning. And when the explanation ended, there was a pause, a space waiting for him to respond with urgency, with concern, with something that matched the tone he had been given, but he did not fill it right away. He simply asked one question, "What changed after I left?" And the voice on the other end faltered, just slightly, because that was not the expected response, and Marcus nodded to himself as if the silence had already answered him. Then he glanced back at his daughter, who stood a few feet away tracing shapes in the dust with the toe of her shoe, patient, quiet, waiting, and he made a decision that did not need to be explained, telling the caller he would come in, but not immediately, that he needed an hour, maybe a little more, and there was a moment of resistance, of pushback wrapped in polite language. But he did not argue. He did not justify. He simply repeated himself once, steady and clear, and when the call ended, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and stood, reaching for his daughter's hand as they began to walk down the sidewalk together, the city stretching out ahead of them in long, uneven lines, and somewhere behind layers of glass and expectation, a system waited for him. But Marcus did not quicken his pace, because he understood something the building did not, that not everything that mattered moved at the speed of urgency. By the time Marcus returned to the building, the light had already shifted, the clean brightness of late afternoon giving way to a softer, dimmer glow that reflected differently against the glass, turning the tower into something less transparent and more like a mirror. And as he stepped through the revolving doors, the air inside felt tighter than he remembered, not louder, but heavier, as if the building itself was holding its breath. And the lobby moved with a different rhythm now. Conversations shorter, footsteps quicker, eyes flicking toward screens with a quiet tension that did not need to be spoken out loud. And Marcus noticed it all without changing his pace, his hand still resting lightly on his daughter's shoulder as he guided her toward the security desk, speaking to the guard in a low voice, explaining that she would sit for a while, that he would not be long. And the guard nodded, his usual easy smile replaced with something more focused, more aware, and the girl took a seat near the corner, pulling out her worksheet from the same backpack Marcus had carried earlier. her pencil moving slowly across the page as if she understood, without needing to be told, that this place required quiet, and Marcus gave her a small nod before turning toward the elevators, his reflection catching briefly in the glass panels that lined the walls, then disappearing as the doors opened and closed around him, carrying him upward through layers of polished silence. And on the 38th floor, Evelyn stood exactly where she had been before, but nothing about her posture felt the same. Her attention no longer spread across multiple screens, but narrowed into a single point. The system feed still lagging just enough to remind her that something remained unresolved. And when the elevator doors opened behind her, she did not turn right away, not because she did not know who had arrived, but because she was measuring something she had never needed to measure before, the space between knowing and understanding, and Marcus stepped into the room without hesitation, his movements unchanged by the environment, by the height, by the expectations that filled the air, and he stopped a few feet from her desk, not too close, not distant, just present, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching in a way that felt different from the silence Evelyn was used to, this one not empty, not controlled, but full of something she could not quite name, and when she finally turned, her eyes met his without the filter of glass, without the distance she had relied on, and she studied him the way she studied everything else, looking for patterns, for indicators, for something that would explain the gap she had felt all day, and Marcus met her gaze without challenge, without submission, just steady, as if he had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. And she asked her question in the same calm tone she used for everything, explaining the issue, the logs, the timing, the connection to his work the previous evening, and Marcus listened without interrupting, his eyes shifting briefly to the screen, to the data she trusted, then back to her, and when she finished, he did not rush to answer, he simply walked past her desk, closer to the display, leaning in slightly, as if listening again, not to the numbers, but to something beneath them, and he reached out, not to type, not to override, just to pause the feed for a second, holding the frame in place as he studied it. And then he spoke, his voice low. Even, you are looking at what it is doing now, but not at what it was trying to do before, and Evelyn frowned, not in disagreement, but in recognition that the sentence did not fit into any model she had been using, and Marcus stepped back, his eyes moving once more across the room, across the glass walls, the reflections, the controlled clarity of it all, and he added quietly, something was already wrong before I touched it. I just slowed it down so it would not break all at once, and the words settled into the space between them, simple, direct, and for the first time since the issue began, Evelyn felt the shape of the problem shift, not in the system, but in the way she had been seeing it all along. The room did not change, but something inside it did, a subtle shift that did not register on any screen, did not appear in any report, but altered the way the space held them, and Evelyn remained still for a moment longer than she normally allowed, her mind recalibrating, not rejecting what he said but rearranging it, testing it against the structure she trusted, and Marcus did not fill the silence. He did not explain further. He simply moved, stepping closer to the system terminal with the same quiet intention he had carried all day, and this time when he touched the keyboard, it was not with urgency, not with the pressure of someone trying to fix something broken, but with the patience of someone listening, and the engineers on the call line went silent as well, their voices fading into the background as they watched the feed from their own screens, unsure whether to interrupt, unsure whether to guide, because nothing about what he was doing matched the speed they were trained to work at, and yet it held a kind of control they could not ignore, and Marcus scrolled back through the system history, not just the last few hours, but further, tracing the pattern the way one might follow a thread through fabric, his eyes narrowing slightly as he paused at certain points, not when errors appeared, but just before them, where small inconsistencies had been dismissed, where the system had tried to correct itself quietly, and he tapped once, highlighting a sequence that looked harmless at first glance, then looked again, and he leaned back just enough to take it in, then forward again, adjusting a single parameter, not rewriting, not overriding, just realigning, and the change did not produce an immediate result, no dramatic shift, no sudden correction, just a subtle easing, like tension being released from something that had been pulled too tight for too long, and the delay in the system shortened by a fraction, then another, until the rhythm began to return, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to show direction, enough to show that the path forward was not where they had been looking, and Evelyn stepped closer without realizing it, her attention fixed not on the outcome, but on the way he moved through the problem, the absence of urgency, the absence of performance, and she realized something that unsettled her more than the issue itself. He was not trying to prove anything, not to her, not to the team, not even to the system. He was simply responding to what was there, and that difference shifted everything. And she asked quietly, "How did you see that?" And Marcus did not look up right away, his hands still resting lightly on the edge of the console as he answered, because it did not start when it broke. It started when it was ignored, and the words landed differently than any technical explanation she had heard that day, because they were not about the system alone. They reached beyond it, into something she recognized but had not named, and the room held that realization in silence, the glass walls reflecting two figures standing closer than before, not separated by distance or height, but by a difference that was beginning to close. And below, in the lobby, a small girl looked up from her worksheet, glancing toward the elevators as if she could feel the shift above her, then returned to her page, her pencil moving steadily across the paper, solving one line at a time, without rushing, without needing to see the whole answer at once. The system did not snap back to perfection. It did not celebrate. It simply began to breathe again, slow and steady, like something that had been holding tension for too long and finally allowed itself to release it. And the engineers on the line started speaking once more, their voices layered with cautious relief, numbers stabilizing, response times tightening, metrics returning to ranges that made sense again. But Evelyn barely heard them, because her attention had shifted somewhere else. Entirely, away from the screens, away from the data, and toward the man standing beside her who had not once looked for acknowledgement. And Marcus stepped back from the console, as if his part in the process had already ended, his hands falling naturally to his sides, his posture unchanged, and he glanced once at the screen, not to admire the result, just to confirm that the system had found its rhythm again. Then he turned slightly, as if preparing to leave, and that movement pulled Evelyn forward before she could think, closing the small distance between them, not physically dramatic, just enough to hold the moment in place a little longer. And she spoke, her voice quieter than before, not less certain, but less distant. "You slowed it down so it would not collapse." And Marcus gave a small nod, his expression steady, and she continued, her words more careful now, as if she was testing each one before letting it exist. "And you saw it before anyone else did." And again he nodded. But this time he added something, not to correct her, but to place the truth where it belonged. "I saw it because I was there when it started, not when it showed up." And the distinction settled into her in a way that data never had, because it carried something beyond information. It carried presence. And Evelyn turned her gaze toward the glass wall without meaning to, her reflection appearing faintly beside the city beyond. And for a brief second, she saw herself the way she had always positioned herself, above, removed, observing, and she realized how much she had relied on that distance, how much she had trusted it to tell her everything she needed to know. And yet it had not shown her this. It had not shown her him. Not really. And she asked the question that had been forming quietly beneath everything else. "Why did you not report it?" And Marcus did not hesitate this time. "Because the answer was not complicated. I thought someone was already watching." And the words landed without force, without accusation, but they carried weight all the same. And Evelyn felt it, not as a challenge, but as a shift, a small fracture in the certainty she had built around how things worked. And she looked back at him, not through a screen, not through a reflection, but directly. And for the first time since he had entered the building, she did not try to categorize him, did not try to reduce him to a role or a line in a report. She simply saw him, the quiet steadiness, the absence of urgency, the presence that did not demand attention but changed the space anyway. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, holding everything that had just been understood. And Marcus gave a slight nod, not as a signal of completion, just acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked toward the elevator without waiting for anything else. His steps the same as before, unhurried, unannounced, and Evelyn remained where she was, her eyes following him until the doors closed and his reflection disappeared from the glass. And for a moment longer, She stayed still, her hand lifting slowly to rest against the surface she had trusted for so long. And this time, it did not feel like clarity, it felt like distance. The elevator descended in silence, the soft hum of motion barely noticeable, and Marcus stood inside with his hands resting loosely at his sides, his reflection faint against the brushed metal walls, not studying himself, not thinking about what had just happened upstairs, just present, as he always was. And when the doors opened into the lobby, the tension that had settled into the building earlier had already begun to dissolve. Conversations returning to normal pace, footsteps losing their edge, screens no longer holding the same quiet urgency, and he stepped out into it without absorbing any of it, his attention already moving toward the corner where his daughter sat, her small frame bent over the worksheet, pencils still moving with the same steady rhythm. And when she looked up and saw him, she smiled in that simple, certain way that did not ask questions first, and he returned it just as easily, walking over and crouching beside her, glancing at the page, noticing the erased lines, the corrected answers, the effort behind each number, and he pointed to one problem gently, not correcting, just guiding, and she nodded, adjusting it on her own, and when she finished, she looked at him for confirmation, and he gave a small nod, enough to let her know she had it right, and they stood together, gathering her things, the moment quiet, complete, and somewhere above them, behind layers of glass that no longer felt as clear as they once had, Evelyn remained standing in her office, her hand still resting against the surface that had always defined her perspective, and she did not move for a long moment, not because she was unsure, but because she was seeing something for the first time, without the filter she had relied on for so long. And slowly, she stepped back from the glass, turning away from the wide view of the city, from the patterns she had trusted, and walked toward her desk, her gaze dropping to the tablet still resting there, the list of staffing changes open, names aligned in clean rows, decisions already made, already processed, and she stared at it for a moment, not at the numbers, but at the absence within them, and without hesitation this time, she reversed. One entry, a single motion undoing what had been decided too quickly, not as a correction of error, but as an acknowledgement of something she had missed, and she set the tablet down again, the action quiet, final, then turned back toward the glass, but she did not step close to it. She stayed where she was, letting the distance remain, and below, Marcus and his daughter walked toward the revolving doors, their pace unhurried, their silhouettes moving together in a way that did not draw attention. And just before they stepped outside, he paused, not because he sensed her watching, but because he always paused before leaving a space, as if giving it a moment to settle behind him, and then he pushed the door forward, the glass turning smoothly as they stepped out into the evening light, the city opening up around them in all its noise and motion, and he did not look back, not once, and Evelyn watched them go until they disappeared into the flow of people, her reflection faint in the glass, her view no longer as certain as it had been that morning, and the building behind her continued to run, systems aligned, numbers stable, everything exactly as it should be, and yet something had changed in a way no report would capture, something quiet, something small, something that did not ask to be measured, because he had not raised his voice, he had not asked to be seen, but in the space between what